Hi, Misha here, and as promised last time, when we look at British armor, we come to the Sherman Firefly. Although officially, these were known as the Sherman Mark 1C or Mark 5C, depending on which base tank was converted. The Sherman 1 was the original M4. The Sherman 5 was the M4A4, and the C was simply British nomenclature for the QF 17 pounder gun, the 76.2 millimeter, which was their attempt to make a technically multi-role, multi-use gun that was still a high-velocity anti-tank gun, because that's kind of what they wanted all along, in a way to have their cake and eat it too. The QF 2 pounder and the QF 6 pounder for their day were very decent to even very good anti-tank guns, but they never had very good high explosive rounds. They never were especially great at soft targets like infantry, unarmored vehicles, in light structures like wood. How it goes. So in a lot of ways, the 75 millimeter gun of the Sherman did better. But they had this QF 17 pounder tested in 1941, and they started using it in the field as early as 1942, and they really wanted to mount it to a tank, and they considered putting it on a Sherman, but the Ministry of Tanks, the Ministry of Design, put the kibosh on this in short order. They didn't feel that this turret could take the gun, because it was quite the massive piece that required quite the distance for recoil. Plus, it had a lot of flash and noise and concussion and everything else. So, what were they going to do? Well, their idea in 1942, they'll just design a British tank to take the QF 17 pounder. And we've already kind of looked at the tanks like the Cromwell and so on and so forth. Also the Challenger and the Comet, and yeah. But these weren't ready. Not nearly in time. What became known as the Firefly started off not just unofficially, but actually in a way against orders. In 1943, Major Brightly had the idea. He looked at the Challenger, the A30 design, which was kind of coming into its beginnings, and just wasn't sold. But he did like the Sherman. And so he took a Sherman and basically fitted a 17 pounder to it. How? He just pulled the entire recoil system out so it would fit, and then he just locked the gun to the turret. Is it that simple? Well, of course not. I mean, it would shoot some, but this means the entire tank is taking the recoil with absolutely no absorption. This is not a workable idea by any stretch of the imagination. But in June of that year, he would find himself with an ally. A Lieutenant Colonel Witheridge would join the school where he was working, and he had been kind of furloughed out of active combat. He had fought in tanks in North Africa and been rather severely injured. So he was back to what we might call light duty, but he was not able to go to the front. And he was a big fan of the Sherman. He had done a tour of duty over in the USA and saw the Sherman there and was a big fan. And he too looked at the Challenger and just wasn't really fond of the direction it was going. And having experience in tanks, he worked on modifying the Sherman's recoil system to work with the 17-pounder gun without having to go to a whole new turret. And word got out about what they were doing, and the DTD sent them a cease and desist letter telling them to immediately just stop, because for whatever reason they just didn't want this. They'd rather work on British designs and just, not. But luckily the two were rather committed. They were both named George, by the way, the two Georges. And Witheridge had some connections, so he kind of ran it up the chain and to the director of the Armored Corps, who eventually took it to the Ministry of Supply. And after a bit of back and forth, it was given the official go-ahead. The only downside, these were just two amateurs, not really supposed to be doing it. So the concept was finally accepted, fully funded, but it was taken out of their hands and taken over to the DTD, where actual professionals would kind of start tinkering with it. And namely, a gentleman by the name of Kilbourne, who worked for Vickers, looked at what the Georges had sketched out and made it into a workable system. He actually just made a whole new recoil system instead of trying to modify the existing one on the Sherman. He realized that while the turret was not deep enough to give the over 3 foot, over 1 meter recoil necessary for the gun, it was actually quite wide by British standards. So he kind of broke the recoil cylinders into two and put them on the sides instead of straight back and under. He also was required to give a new gun mantlet, a new mount, and the bore, the barrel of the gun itself had to be reworked, and it had to be flipped around. The breech had to be reworked, and its loading system was flipped 90 degrees. So instead of loading from the top, it would load from the side. This required reworking of the loader, commander, gunner, and the turret, and it was a very cramped turret now. And they had to add a second loading hatch, the second exit hatch on top, lest the loader have to shimmy under the gun. So, a lot had to be done. Also, back here, they cut a hole in the back of the turret. This was for the radio. Typically, in a British tank, the radio would be in the back of the turret. Well, there would not be room with the new gun, so they made a little tiny radio box back here that guy could kind of crawl in and stick himself in to use the radio. It worked. This also had the benefit of working as kind of a counterweight to the big gun. So even if there wasn't a radio, they'd usually put some kind of ballast there. As for the hull, the most noteworthy change, you still have a driver, of course. The hull machine gunner's position was removed, so they would have room for more shells. The 17-pounder shells, again 76.2 millimeter, were quite a bit taller, quite a bit longer than previous 75 millimeter shells. So they needed to have space for more. For example, the Challenger could only carry about 42 rounds. If they took over the position there, they could put over 75 rounds in the tank, up to 77 usually. Although only about 24 were readily in reach for combat. The rest were stored outside the tank or had to be maneuvered around. So we don't have the hull machine gun. We still have the coaxially mounted Browning here, 30 caliber. And in theory, we still have the 50 caliber on top, which was an M2. But because of the extra hatch and just the overall layout now, it more or less got in the way and was of limited use. So typically, just to save weight, complexity, they'd just pull it off. Wasn't really needed. In other ways, it was pretty much a standard Sherman. It wasn't any faster, more maneuverable, used a gasoline engine, didn't really have any extra armor, to speak of. About 19.5 feet long, not counting the gun. If you count the gun, because it sticks out so far, we're over 25 feet, so it does make the whole package about 6 foot longer. We're a little under 35 tons. We have a maximum speed of just shy of 25 miles per hour. Classified as a medium tank, so we're kind of getting away from the whole cruiser infantry tank thing here. Again, in most ways, it's a standard Sherman. So when I finally do get to the Sherman video, we'll probably revisit this a little bit more. Then they would use these to convert. Like I said, they would use the M4, the Sherman 1, and the M4A4, the Sherman 5. They typically didn't use the others for whatever reason. It's just what they had. So things are progressing quite well in the fall of 1943. And then the Army gets wind of it in October. And they really love this idea. The Sherman's a known quantity. It can be done cheaply and quickly. And the Cromwell and the Challenger aren't shaking out as well as they'd hoped. So this seems like a good backup plan. So the Army decides to order over 2,000 conversions. Just as testing is about to begin, the first conversions were produced in January of 1944, and then final testing and trials were in February, where everything was kind of locked down. Also, Winston Churchill got involved. Again, we're kind of running this at the flagpole, and he insisted that this be given a very high priority for materiel, so that pretty much clinched it. The reason they were in such a hurry, D-Day was coming, the Normandy invasions. They knew that, and they needed an anti-tank weapon. They had M10s and a few other things, but they knew of the newer Tigers and Panthers. They didn't know how many they would encounter. They needed something to punch through German armor effectively at range. And if it could also have a high explosive round, more is the better. As it turned out at this time, really there wasn't a good high explosive 17-pounder round, although it would come eventually towards the end of 1944, beginning of 1945, kind of finally fulfilling the high velocity dual purpose thing. So it was in production. The name Firefly appears in late winter. Mayfly is also used, but again, officially it's just Sherman 1C or Sherman 5C. But Firefly is so much catchier. And they are converting these as quick as they can. By the end of May 1944, right before D-Day, they've converted to nearly 350, and so they are available for the D-Day landing. And they quickly re-equip some Sherman units with these. Luckily, because it's a Sherman, retraining, familiarization is simple. They also do re-equip a few Cromwell crews with these, but it does make logistics more difficult. But others that are having infantry tanks, like, say, the Churchill, are not given the Firefly. So these are there at Normandy, and production continues. And it's a good thing they did push this forward, because, as it would turn out, the British Army would run into a majority, 2/3 or more, of the heavy German armor in France. There weren't just scads upon scads of Tigers, but there were more Panthers than they anticipated. And they all pretty much went for the British. And that was kind of by intent to some extent. So it was actually very good that they had these. Typically they'd have one Firefly for every 3 Shermans there. They operated alongside the 75mm gun-equipped Shermans because they still were better at attacking infantry and soft targets. They worked well together. And the Firefly was good at punching through Panthers and Tigers. In fact, it could knock through German armor up to 6 inches out to 1,000 yards and up to 6.5 inches at 500 yards. So, yeah, and it was the only thing they had that could really reliably knock out a Panther at range. If they wanted to use a smaller gun, they had to get in closer, which was kind of dangerous. So they were rather well liked. And this really was one of the most powerful anti-tank guns that the Allies had in World War II. And of course it would be carried over to the Comet, which was designed specifically for it, whereas this is more of a ad hoc thing. But it would continue throughout France, into the Low Countries, into the Netherlands, and of course into Western Germany. These were also used in smaller numbers in Italy. And they weren't just used by the Brits. They were given to the Polish detachment, the Czechoslovakian divisions. They were also given to some South Africans fighting in Europe. The Free French had some. The Canadians had some. And the New Zealander detachments had some. So they kind of scattered them about because they were really cranking these out. They produced another 400, give or take, that summer, and production would continue at a good clip. In fact, by February of 1945, so just about a year after the project began, they had built about 2,000. And they had plenty of Shermans to spare because American industry had lend-leased a large number to the UK. And of course, these would continue and see use during the Battle of the Bulge, so on and so forth. And it was well received and well liked, but of course, it wasn't perfect. In fact, it's kind of in the name. Firefly is because of the giant muzzle flash, especially at night from this gun. Even with this long barrel, we have a big flash which could blind the crew if not protected or blinking or something. It also had a lot of concussion, could really rattle their bones. And like I said, they could only get to about 24 rounds while in combat, so hopefully they didn't fire through all their stuff. And it's a little slower than the cruisers. They were topping out at 30 to 32 miles per hour, whereas, like I said, this could only reach 25 in bursts, and so it was a little slower, a little heavier, and it had kind of the American suspension. And of course, it suffered from the just, not made here thing. And, it was a product of exactly what it was, something slapped together for the war. And as famously is known, the Germans recognized it by the long barrel and would go out of their way to destroy these because, of course, they were a big threat. The Brits did what they could to disguise the long barrel with different paint schemes. They also tended to put these towards the rear, letting the standard Shermans go front, and then as tanks come out, they would target them because they did have the range. But they were a target on the battlefield. But pretty damn good tank. Tank killer, all things considered. Well, once they reached 2,000, by March of 45, they decided to kind of throttle back the conversion work, the production. The last ones were delivered in May. We don't really know how many exactly were converted. 21 to 2,200 is the common number. But they knew they didn't need more. Germany was essentially done for by this point, and they had enough. Plus, the Comet was coming online. Heck, even the Centurion was finally coming online too. And it would be initially equipped with the 17-pounder, and then later, of course, larger guns. Now, Britain expected it would keep fighting, but against the Japanese after Germany. And the Japanese, they were in desperate straits, and they never were for big fighting. So, honestly, the QF 2-pounder might have been able to punch through the Japanese armor. Certainly the QF6 and the QF75 would have been fine against the Japanese. So they just weren't needed against them. And of course, in any event, the war would end earlier than expected in the Pacific as well. So production was over. And in the UK, since these were an interim, always meant to be a stopgap thing, they were pretty quickly pulled out of service and replaced with Cromwell's, Comets, and Centurions. They were sold abroad and given away. They would appear in all kinds of out-of-the-way places throughout the 50s, and some were still in service into the 80s, certain regions, because if nothing else, it was a powerful gun, and the M4, well, replacement parts are easy enough to get for them, most part. So it was quite the success, despite the DTD trying to derail it. Now this model is from Dragon. It does have a moving turret and moving gun. Pretty nice detail, but it's pretty light. It's mostly plastic. But not many do the Firefly, and it does come with a nice case. In a lot of ways, they're very similar to Hobby Master. So I thought I would show you this. I believe this one's actually in livery of where it had been captured by the Germans. They did respect it, that's for sure. And again, we'll visit it more when we get to the M4 Sherman video, because we'll have to talk about what makes an M4, M4A1, M4A2, all the way up to the EZ8. But since we're doing British stuff, I had to talk about this, because it was very important to their war effort. Alrighty, folks. Appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. All that fun stuff. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.